words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Well, we're coming up on the halfway mark of our journey through these 40 days of Lent. Lent, a time of reflection, a time for us to consider what it is like for ourselves to endure the suffering of the cross, the darkness of the tomb, and the expectation of resurrection. I've been thinking a good deal about this cycle this week. I see the pattern all around us. I would invite you, when you go home, I'm sure Christian's Yard is one that is a perfect example. I visited Lee this week, and she took me out to her garden in the back of her house, and she shared with me the rebirth that is taking place in her garden. Buds and new growth coming out everywhere on the bushes and the trees, seedlings popping their little heads out of the planter boxes that she has. And we saw new little green fruit on her kumquat tree. Is it a tree or a bush? It's a tree. Okay. And just a month ago, when I visited, she showed me all the things that she was anticipating would be blooming and growing, but everything was dead, barren branches that hid that life within. And through the winter, we have lived, all of us, through the suffering and death of the season. But here in spring, we begin to see the signs of hope, that hope of rebirth and the renewal that comes when we submit to this process, when we surrender to God. And we allow God to take our hands and guide us through our own journey toward resurrection. Lent is our opportunity to focus on God in maybe a unique and special way. It allows ourselves the opportunity to be refreshed and encouraged, just as Jesus' disciples were when they were in company with him. Now, our series is Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places. Well, it seems like there's no end to the wrong places we can look for love. Am I right? Well, I know right after high school, I went off to college at Oregon State, and I joined a sorority, you can imagine. Well, maybe you shouldn't imagine that of your pastor, but one of the things I like best about the sorority, I'll be honest, were the weekend parties. All the fraternities in town would open their doors wide for all the young sorority girls to come. Each weekend, we'd get ourselves dressed up in our skinniest jeans, back when I could wear skinny jeans, high platform heels. I'd spend, seems like hours when I had hair, and blowing and curling and teasing and spraying. We had to look just right because we were on the prowl. We were looking for love in the basement of a fraternity. Now, I did find a few things at those parties, but I'm pretty sure none of it was love. But that's what we had. That's what we thought was going to bring happiness to our young co-ed selves. Maybe some of you have looked for love in those places. Maybe in abusive relationships with drugs or alcohol. Some seek satisfaction in life through overwork or shopping or overeating. I read this week from Blaise Pascal, something he wrote in 1670, and it's as true today as when he wrote it then. This is from a book in defense of the Christian religion. He writes, "What else does this craving, this helplessness proclaim but that there was once a man, in man, a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are. Though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object. In other words, by God himself." whether we acknowledge it or not, we are hardwired to seek God, to fill that empty God-shaped hole that is within us. We are forever seeking the Thirst-Quencher. And God has been attempting to demonstrate our whole lives and throughout Scripture that He will always provide for us, whether it's our need for the necessities of life and food and shelter and water, or our spiritual or physical needs. In Exodus, we read this morning that God's people were thirsting for water. In fact, they were complaining, as only the Israelites could do. Wandering through the desert, we're hungry, we're thirsty. Are we there yet? I wish we'd never left Egypt. And so Moses went to the Lord with this problem. And it's no surprise God solved it, right? Water was provided because, see, God is in the habit of providing for our needs. And in our scripture from the Gospel of John, Jesus has a remarkable encounter with a Samaritan woman. God was getting ready to provide for her and her family just what they needed. You see, Jesus and his disciples were heading to Galilee, and they'd chosen that shortest path, right, the most direct through Samaria. They could have gone east, right, through Jordan, which is what most self-respecting Jews would have done. They would have taken the longer route, twice the traveling time, but it was worth it to avoid the Samaritans. You see, they were beneath the Jews. They were despised people. They were living on the outside in the margins. Now, the Samaritans were Jews, but they weren't Jerusalem Jews. You see the difference? And it made a difference. Jesus, of course, didn't care about that. Jesus never cares about things like that. Who's on the inside? Who's on the outside? He sees all of us as beloved. And Jesus knew that his message of God's love and grace was to be shared also with the Samaritans. So Jesus approaches Jacob's well, and he instructs his disciples to go on ahead, get the supplies they needed. He would wait at the well and rest. Now it was in the middle of the day, and a woman came to draw well for her household, to draw water for her household. Jennifer and I were there at the well a couple of years ago, and it is a deep, deep well. They said more than 100 feet. Now I'm sure Jesus had an idea about this woman. It was midday, and what kind of woman comes to the well at midday? Well, most women come early in the morning. It's supposed that this woman came at noon because in the outcast, she was an outcast. She didn't want to go and be there in the morning with the other women. And thirsty from his travel, Jesus asked her for a drink. And shocked that Jesus would even speak to her, let alone ask for something like a drink, she says, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask of me, a woman of Samaria?" You see, she was a Samaritan first, right? And a Jew second. I imagine that Jesus probably was smiling a little bit. He was just waiting to engage her in conversation so he could explain what he was really doing there. Yes, he was thirsty, and yes, getting a drink was important, but Jesus went right to the heart of the matter. He skipped the insignificant banter about the weather and offers her living water. He reveals himself to her. He offers her the living water that will quench her life's thirst for meaning, her need for unconditional love and acceptance, her need for grace. She doesn't quite understand what Jesus is talking about, and I'm not sure that we would have either the first time we heard it. Because, see, most of us, we focus on the things that we can see and feel and touch. It's harder to get at the spiritual foundation of our lives. It's harder to understand and accept the living water, the water that quenches our spiritual thirst once and for all. So she asks Jesus for this living water. And Jesus tells her to go get her husband and then come back. And here's where it gets interesting. Do you love this part of the story? This is like my favorite part. Because he sees right through her, right? She is transparent before him as he says, oh yes, you are correct. You have no husband. You've had 5 husbands. And this man you're with now isn't one of them. And Jesus tells her what she has been waiting for and what she's been waiting to hear her entire life. The time has come. The time is now. When, quoting scripture, the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father seeks such as these to worship him, those such as the Samaritan woman and all of us gathered here. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And then I think Jesus just blows her mind, right? Because he says to her, I am he. I am Messiah. This unnamed woman finally finds the love that she has been looking for her entire life. She can say goodbye to those things that only brought temporary relief, a momentary respite in her search for love. She's face to face with Messiah, the Son of God, the Redeemer of the universe. And I think like this woman, we too have tried our entire life to find and fill ourselves up with living water. That water that can only be received through Jesus Christ. This living water is cool and fragrant. It's that peace that refreshes our soul. It is God through Jesus Christ who satisfies our basic need for water. And through Christ, we drink in God's grace. We allow ourselves to surrender our very lives to the risen Christ. And through this surrender, we are filled up to overflowing with the love of God, and we are called then to share it, not to keep it for ourselves in some selfish fashion, but to touch the lives of others at every opportunity. To demonstrate to the world that we are followers of Jesus Christ, living as he lived, reaching into the margins of our society and finding those who also need this living water. And with Christ's living water flowing through us, we become conduits of God's grace. We become loving and passionate, willing to sacrifice ourselves for the needs of our community. The water from the well will quench our thirst for a day, but with Christ as our foundation, we will never, ever thirst again for the peace of Christ that God has given to us freely.